The colonization of America is a divisive subject, with some celebrating the religious freedoms and political liberty that America offered, to European migrants and others lamenting the destruction of many Native American civilizations through war and disease. It is hard to say how the world would look today if Europeans had failed to colonize America, or what would have happened if Native Americans had been able to interact with the rest of the world on their own terms. A lot happened in the 291 years between Columbus's first voyage to the Caribbean and the end of colonization symbolized by the British defeat in the Revolutionary War. So keep watching as we explore 7 little-known facts about the colonization of America. Number 1. Columbus didn't discover North America. Columbus Day has been a bank holiday in the United States since 1971. However, Christopher Columbus never actually set foot in what is now the United States. Even America's name is said to have come from another explorer named Amerigo Vespucci, who was the first to suggest that the land Columbus stumbled across was a separate continent. A German cartographer, Martin Waldseemüller, labeled the continent a Latinized version of Amerigo, America. One of the first Europeans to sight North America, aside from the Viking explorers, was Italian explorer Giovanni da Verrazzano. The French king commissioned Verrazzano to find a westward passage to Asia. He reached Cape Fear in March 1524, before sailing northward and exploring the North American coast. Verrazzano sailed up the coast to the eastern part of Newfoundland, sighting what would become New York Harbor, Block Island, and Narragansett Bay. He interacted with Native American tribes along the coast, finding them to be generally welcoming and kind, although the explorers were wary of them. In one incident, a young sailor was instructed to swim ashore with gifts of bells and mirrors. But after throwing the goods ashore, he was so tossed about by the waves that he was carried up onto the beach half dead. Seeing this, the native people immediately ran up. They took him by the head, the legs, and arms and carried him some distance away. Whereupon the youth, realizing he was being carried away like this, was seized with terror and began to utter loud cries. They answered him in their language to show him he should not be afraid. The story continues, saying that the Native Americans took off his wet clothes and placed the sailor near a fire, causing the sailors aboard the boat to think they were going to roast and eat him. Of course, they were just warming him up. Verrazzano concludes the tale by saying he regained his strength and showed them by signs that he wanted to return to the ship. With the greatest kindness, they accompanied him to the sea, holding him close and embracing him, and to reassure him, they withdrew to a high hill and stood watching him until he was in the boat. Not only did Columbus never see the United States, but the first successful American colony at Jamestown was founded 75 years after the first Portuguese settlement was established in Brazil, and a full 115 years after Columbus's first voyage. Number 2. Relationships between the colonizers and the Native Americans were diverse and complicated. A common trope for Europeans colonizing America is that they thought the continent was largely uninhabited, or that they tricked the native tribes out of their land with beads and trinkets. However, this is far from the truth. In fact, the early settlers knew full well about the diversity of the native tribes, and trade was well established between the newcomers and the locals. Before the arrival of the Europeans, Native American society was a complex network of interconnected tribes. For instance, the Iroquois engaged in social psychological warfare known as mourning wars, which would allow members to cope with the grief of losing a loved one by raiding rival villages and acquiring captives, who would then either be adopted or killed by the raiding tribes. The arrival of the Europeans, who brought new weapons and unwittingly spread foreign diseases through the native population, changed and intensified conflicts between the tribes. A prime example of this is the Beaver Wars between the Iroquoian and Algonquin groups. The Iroquoians expanded their military due to European firearms and iron tools, which they exchanged for beaver pelts. The interaction with the Europeans led to many Iroquoians contracting European diseases, which resulted in an increase in mourning wars in an effort to maintain their population. The reliance on beaver pelts also led to territorial conflicts with neighboring tribes, as the Iroquoians expanded their hunting grounds. The warfare led to further depopulation, trapping the tribes in a dangerous cycle. Soon, some of the native tribes formed alliances with European powers, such as the French, Spanish, and British, who in turn used the cooperation of the tribes for their own territorial struggles. When Britain came out on top, the defeated tribes were displaced, while victorious tribes were given more land. The Native Americans believed this would end European expansion. It did not, and the deep rifts that had been formed between the Native American tribes kept them from working together to stop the European invasion. As more European settlers arrived in America and began to become more self-sufficient, full-blown persecution of all Native Americans was soon rife. Due to intertribal wars and foreign diseases, the Native Americans did not have the numbers to defend themselves properly. In 1836, the Oregon Trail opened in earnest, sealing the fate of many Native Americans who had, so far, escaped the machinations of the Europeans. Number 3. Although Jamestown was the first official colony, it wasn't the first English settlement in North America. Everyone knows the story of the Pilgrims on the Mayflower and the settlers of Jamestown Colony. However, neither of these groups were the first English to live in North America, although they were the first to live in a permanent settlement. Once land had been discovered across the Atlantic, fishermen, mainly from Portugal, France, the Basque region, and England, soon set up fishing camps off the coastline of what is now Canada. These semi-permanent camps were documented on maps dating back to 1541, allowing the capital of Newfoundland and Labrador to boast that it is the oldest English-founded city in North America. In 1578, English sailor Martin Frobisher tried to find the Northwest Passage and attempted to establish a colony on Baffin Island. Still, it was abandoned by the end of the summer, and the prospective settlers returned to England with a cargo of what they had supposed to be gold ore. On their return, it was discovered that their haul had been pyrite, or fool's gold, and Frobisher lost his financial support. Perhaps the most famous pre-Jamestown settlement was the Roanoke colony, whose mysterious disappearance is still cause for speculation today. Number 4. Sweden colonized most of Delaware. Although the Spanish, Dutch, French, and English were the leading contenders in colonizing the Americas, Sweden also threw its hat into the ring. In March 1638, the Swedish Empire established New Sweden on the Delaware River in what is now the state of Delaware, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. The colony ultimately failed due to clashes with the Dutch and a lack of ongoing support from Sweden. In 1655, the Dutch annexed the colony, although the Swedish settlers were allowed to keep their lands and continue their customs. Swedes and Finns continued to live in the area, even after the English took over and set up their Pennsylvania colony in the 1680s. Visitors reported hearing the Swedish language spoken in the region until the 1750s. Number 5. The Plymouth colonists arrived just after a huge epidemic had devastated the local population. When the initial settlement party, sponsored by the Virginia Company of Plymouth, searched for a suitable site for their colony, they came across a parcel of uninhabited land that they thought would be perfect for their endeavor. What they didn't know was why the land was uninhabited. They presumed that the continent just wasn't densely populated. In fact, in the years before they arrived, the Native Americans living on the southeastern coast of modern-day Massachusetts had been suffering from a mysterious epidemic that had caused the deaths of a large portion of the population. Historians have speculated about which disease was responsible, although all agree it would have been introduced by contact with Europeans. One possibility is that the European rodents spread an infectious disease like leptospirosis, which contaminated water supplies. Whatever the cause, the fact that the disease nearly annihilated Native Americans in the area facilitated the successful colonization of the region and explains the tense relationship between the colonists and the local tribes. Number 6. Manifest destiny created the Dust Bowl. There were many unintended consequences of the colonization of America, and one was the Dust Bowl. Everyone is familiar with the image of a dusty and desolate Wild West, but in actuality, the settling of the West directly led to the dust and desolation. Before the European settlers started moving west en masse, the Great Plains were populated by bison that fed on the deep-rooted prairie grass. When the Europeans came, they didn't come just to hunt the bison, they came to farm. The first wave of settlers arrived after a time of plentiful rain in the area, and they plowed the soil, uprooting the prairie grass and planting shallow-rooting seasonal crops like corn and wheat. The tilling of the soil, coupled with the herds of longhorn cattle that now churned up the plains, meant that in years of drought, there was nothing to protect the topsoil. By the 1930s, giant rolling dust storms swept across the plains, lasting anywhere from 1 hour to 3 or 4 days. Animals suffocated and people choked as dirt filled the air. In 1935, a cold front from Canada collided with warm air over the Dakotas, and a raging wind displaced around 300,000 tons of topsoil, creating a huge dust cloud that swept across the country, reaching as far as the East Coast. Number 7. The colonization of America and its surrounding areas cooled the planet's climate. Perhaps the most surprising repercussion of the colonization of America is that scientists from the University College in London have concluded that it may have contributed to cooling the planet, resulting in the so-called Little Ice Age in Europe, where the Thames would regularly freeze over. The study suggests that the devastation of the North and South American native populations caused large areas of agricultural land to be abandoned, after which fast-growing trees and vegetation swiftly reclaimed it. Researcher Alexander Koch and his colleagues proposed that the great dying of the indigenous peoples of the Americas led to the abandonment of enough cleared land that the resulting terrestrial carbon uptake had a detectable impact on both atmospheric CO2 and global surface air temperatures. The team reached their conclusions by reviewing all the population data on how many people lived in the Americas before the Europeans arrived in 1492. According to their calculations, America was home to around 10% of the world's population at the time, around 60 million people. This figure dropped drastically to just 5 or 6 million within 100 years to foreign disease and warfare. As the native population across 7 regions was wiped out, the Caribbean, Mexico, Central America, and Inca territory, researchers estimate that somewhere in the range of 56 million hectares, over 138 billion acres of land cultivated by indigenous civilizations would have fallen into disuse. The team surmised that the amount of carbon dioxide that was sucked up by these new forests resulted in the marked cooling around the time of the 1500s and 1600s. The drop in CO2 at this time is evidenced in ice core records from Antarctica. Air bubbles trapped in the ice show a drop in concentration of carbon dioxide. All to say, if it weren't for the drastic drop in population in those 7 regions, natural vegetation wouldn't have taken over, creating such an imbalance in CO2 and eventually leading to the cooling of the globe's temperature. How would you like to get a deeper understanding of history, impress your friends, and predict the future more accurately based on past events? If this sounds like something you might be into, then check out the brand new Captivating History Book Club by clicking the first link in the description. To learn more about the colonization of America, check out our book, History of Colonial America, a captivating guide to the colonial history of the United States, Puritans, and Hutchinson, the Pilgrims, Mayflower, Pico War, and Quakers. It's available as an ebook, paperback. Also, grab your free Mythology Bundle ebook while it's still available. All links are in the description. If you found the video captivating, please hit the like button and subscribe for more videos like this.